If it passes all the final hurdles, CETA has the potential to be even bigger than NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Joining us now to detail what exactly is and isn't in the deal, here's Barrie McKenna, columnist and national business correspondent with the Globe and Mail, and it's great to have you in the studio.
Good evening.
You've been on the program before, but always on some satellite in some far-flung place, so good to have you here. Okay, October 18th, an agreement in principle reached between Canada and the EU. What does it mean when two parties reach, in this case, an agreement in principle?
It means they've sort of identified the big issues. They've gone through every section of the deal. They've initialized things. It then all has to go to the lawyers for scrubbing, as they call it.
Scrubbing?
Scrubbing, yes.
Which
that's
means what?
The technical term. Well, you take the language they've got and you make sure that it says what the negotiators think it says. And then after that, it has to go to the 28 legislatures of the European Union. It also has to be ratified by the House of Commons. But the big problem is in Europe. It's going to take a little while, probably 2 years to get all that done, including the scrubbing.
4 years to negotiate and 2 years to approve. Huh.
Correct.
Okay. Do you think everybody is crystal clear at this point what's in it and what's not in it? And when I say everybody, I don't mean the population at whole. I mean the people who actually negotiated it and the lawyers who have to scrub it.
I mean, I think there are certain elements that are quite clear. They've agreed on certain tariffs. There are 9,000 tariffs on Canadian products entering Europe, and they've gone through them. And they will go to zero, essentially, outside of agriculture, where a lot of them will go to zero. That's a lot of tariff lines. They've agreed to that, and they've basically agreed to make most of them effective as soon as the deal goes into place. But because this deal is one of these new complex trade agreements, it has provisions on government purchases, which is a huge area, on investment, on services, all of those things. We don't know exactly how that's going to play out because there are no tariff lines on those things. So it's much more complicated, and some of the details are still to be worked out on that.
Well, you know, critics always allege that there are also sort of secret side deals that nobody's very clear about at all. Do you know if that's a part of this story?
There may be some things like that because there are. They've released, the Canadian government has released a 26-page version, their summary of what's in it. The deal itself will likely be in the hundreds, if not 1,000 pages of documents. So to boil that down into 26 pages, you know there's a whole lot missing.
Does anybody ever actually read all 1,000 pages of this thing?
I'm not going to, but trade lawyers will, and you'll zero in on the sections that affect you as a particular industry. You know, you'll zero right in, and you know what's important to you, and you'll look for the fine print.
There are always, after these things are done, people looking to see who's up, who's down, who won, who lost, whose ox is gored, who's going to do fine. So let's go through that a bit if we can. Can you say at this stage, unambiguously, this sector won? I
think manufacturers in Ontario have won in a big way. There are tariffs ranging from 2 all the way up to 20-something% going into Europe, and they're going to be going to zero on those things. At the same time, they're going to have to compete with people here who have tariffs, but the European ones are generally higher, so in that way, Canada gains. In terms of winners, in agriculture, beef producers, pork producers have won quota for duty-free entry up to a certain amount, which they didn't have before, a market which they're not in a big way, and they're going to be in that now.
So we will have, our producers here will have access
Correct.
To the European market in a way we never had in the past. So they're pleased about that. Okay, unambiguous losers as a result of this agreement.
I don't think anything is unambiguous in trade. Certainly the Canadian dairy farmers and within that cheese producers have made the loudest noises about being losers.
What's their concern?
What the deal does is it essentially doubles the amount of duty-free entry of European fine cheeses. So your Bries, your Emmentals, all of that, they're going to be able to bring in about double. It's still a very small percentage of the total Canadian market, which is tightly controlled under Canada's supply management system, and the supply management system stays intact and in place. So we're talking about the margins of an industry. So they are losers in part of their industry, but in essence, the system we have stays in place, and the good incomes that farmers get and the good profit margins of the processors are still in place.
Do you know why the European negotiators agreed to that? Because there's been no end of criticism over them, in particular over the last year or two, of our supply management system, and that it's a, not my words, this is the words of some critics, you know, it's a sop to Quebecers to make sure that whoever's in power gets their votes. Why did the Europeans agree to leave that system, which so many people don't like, in place?
Because they heavily subsidized their own agricultural producers and have all sorts of protections that they were not willing to get rid of. So it was
tit for tat.
Tit for tat.
In terms of what's best for trade, do you think it was good that all of these barriers were left in place as it relates to dairy?
I think Canada, if you look out into the future, a world that's starving for protein consumption, Canada has this sweet spot that it could be exploiting. And because of supply management, we can't do it because of this tit for tat. If Canada, there are other negotiations, there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership where there are big dairy producers and getting into Asia. The Asians are consuming tremendous amounts of chicken, of dairy, of all sorts of things they never consumed before because of their growing middle classes. And we're not going to be able to get in there because of supply management. And this is an opportunity lost, a huge opportunity lost as we go forward.
Any indication that either of the sides, Canada or the EU, would be prepared to engage in future negotiations on this one sector only, given that both of them appear to be living in glass houses on this?
I think once you're in an agreement like this, it provides the context for doing that. As we've seen with the Americans on NAFTA, there's an ongoing dialogue between the two sides, and the ministers meet on a regular basis to update and see how the agreement is working for both sides. So it provides a forum to do that going into the future.
All right, you told us a few minutes ago that in order to get this ratified, there are 20, how many over there?
28.
28 different legislative bodies that will have to approve this. Is that to say that if one of them decides they don't like this deal is done?
No, because they've delegated authority to the European Union to negotiate their trade agreements. But it still has to go through those legislatures, and you have elections in various countries that could intercede, and it could become a lightning rod, and there could be pressure to change certain aspects. There's no indication at this point that will happen. There don't seem to be major contentious issues. Both sides have taken exemptions, like we talked about on agriculture. Same thing on government purchasing, where the two sides have taken bits of their market and they put them aside and said, this is not going to be part of the deal. This is not going to be affected. And that has gone on during the negotiations. The 28 states, as have the provinces in Canada, have been at the table all along. And they've seen the negotiations go along, and they've identified the problem areas, and they've alerted their respective negotiators to keep those things off the table.
Provinces have been at the table, but the provinces, I gather, do not have to, in each of their legislatures, ratify this agreement. Is that right?
No, there's a provision for them to provide approval, and there's been assurances, but there's nothing there that provides ironclad guarantees.
Now, again, just looking over in Europe, if there were an election, let's say in the next few months, and a sort of, for lack of a better expression, a pro-trade government were defeated, and in its place, a very much more chauvinistic, tariffs and barriers up, a government came into place, are you saying that they would have to swallow this treaty and that there would be no way for them to get out of it?
There probably are ways to make some changes, but essentially this is the deal. With the exception of those areas that are not defined yet. So I think in those areas where it's not defined, that's where you might have some issues.
So if this is the deal, and they really can't do anything about it anyway, why is it going to take 2 years to get it ratified?
The Europeans don't do anything quickly. You look at how they've dealt with the crisis over there. It's been like watching sort of bad paint dry over a long period of time. This thing is wound through the system.
So we're quick and efficient compared to them.
Absolutely.
We really are, eh?
Yeah.
I haven't heard that before. Okay. Just fill in some blanks that our viewers may have about what kind of business we actually do. What are the big exports that currently we send to Europe?
if you look at the top exports that we do, it's very much the sort of hewers of wood, drawers of water. Unfortunately, we sell a lot of product of mining operations, ores, minerals. Some of it unprocessed, a lot of it unprocessed because it goes into Europe actually currently duty-free. We sell aircraft, aerospace parts and equipment. We sell soybean.
Subways?
We do sell subways. Bombardier is a big player in the European market.
Given once this new deal is in place, 2 years from now, and we bring you back here in 2015 and you tell us about why this thing finally got through, is there any reason to expect that what we send over there now will be different?
I think it does. I mean, it opens up this whole area of services that I talked about, and government purchasing. A big part of government purchasing is not in pens and papers and equipment, it's in services. And Canada happens to be a very good producer of a number of business services. IT services, engineering, obviously, in spite of the problems that SNC and Lavalin has had, but we have architectural firms, IT consulting, business consulting in general. We really have a strong presence in that market, and being able to get into the various national governments in Europe, the EU government, and subnational governments, so cities and local government. We're going to be able to get in there and sell much more than we do now.
Now, I know you're a business guy, not a political guy, but I'm going to ask you a bit of a political question here anyway. And that is, you and I are both old enough to remember all of the debates around the free trade agreement with the United States and then NAFTA after that. And they were certainly portrayed, as they were, as major nation-building historic achievements. Stephen Harper has suggested this belongs in the same league. And in fact, if you look at the numbers of people involved and the dollar figures involved, it's actually bigger. Is he right to claim that?
I don't know about bigger, because Europe represents a relatively small share of our international trade compared to what we have with the United States. About less than 10% of our exports go to Europe, 75% of our exports go to the United States. So we're right next door. Our companies are much more interlinked in the supply chain. The fact that we've done it during difficult economic times with Europe, which one might have thought might have become more protectionist in the wake of the financial crisis, I think it is an achievement. And it is a huge market. And Canada has this problem where our trade is too heavily focused on the United States, and we want to diversify it. Unfortunately, we want to diversify it into the new world as opposed to the old world, which Europe represents. But if you look forward, there's a good possibility that Europe will be coming out of its economic funk as this deal goes into place, and we would have an advantage over the Americans, who will be 2 years behind us in negotiating an agreement with the Americans. So we get this competitive advantage.
What's the status of the United States' efforts to have a similar treaty with the EU?
It's just getting underway now. And unlike Canada, where the Prime Minister can negotiate and sign a deal, the President cannot. He has to go back to Congress and get negotiating authority. And I don't know whether you've been paying any attention to what's going on in the United States recently. It's very hard to get agreement on everything.
Or anything.
Anything. And so getting trade negotiating authority on a huge agreement like this is going to be very problematic for any U.S. administration, whether it's Obama or his successor.
Gotcha. Barrie McKenna from the Globe and Mail. It's good of you to come into TVO tonight and help explain all this to us. Appreciate it.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.